The May sun, a familiar friend to Roland Keaton for all his 67 years, felt unusually hostile this morning. It glinted off the clipboard in the young man's hand and the perfectly coiffed blonde hair of the woman standing beside him. She pointed a manicured finger, its nail the color of a blood rose, at the fence. It was not just any fence. It was a line of weathered cedar posts and taut wire that had marked the edge of the Keaton ranch since his father had sunk the first post in 1968. As per the community plat map, Mr. Keaton, this fence is encroaching on HOA common area, the woman said. Her voice was smooth, polished, and utterly devoid of warmth. This is your courtesy notice. Roland's gaze shifted from her face Judith Cranford, president of the board for the estates at Willow Creek subdivision that now bordered his western pasture, to the young inspector from the Architectural Control Committee. The boy, barely out of his teens, looked miserable, his polo shirt already showing damp patches under the arms. He wouldn't meet Roland's eye. Roland leaned against a sturdy post, the wood warm and familiar under his palm. He smelled the dry grass, the distant scent of his cattle, the faint trace of oil from the barn. It was the smell of his life. Judith smelled of expensive perfume and righteous indignation. "Ma'am," Roland began, his voice a low, patient rumble that had calmed spooked horses and fussy grandchildren. "This fence has stood on this exact line for over 50 years. This line was set by the county surveyor long before your houses were a blueprint." Judith smiled, a slight, chilling upturn of her lips. "Things change. Mr. Keaton, the association commissioned a new survey last fall to clarify common area boundaries for our landscaping initiatives. According to our accredited surveyor, a 10-foot wide strip on your side of this fence is designated as a common area landscape easement." She tapped her clipboard. "The fence is non-compliant. It will have to be moved." She said it with the finality of a doctor delivering a diagnosis. The young inspector scribbled a note, the scratching of his pen the only sound for a moment. A courtesy notice. The phrase was an absurdity. There was no courtesy here. Only a declaration of war cloaked in the sterile language of bureaucracy. "There's no easement on my deed," Roland said, his patience beginning to fray. "My property line is my property line. The HOA has no jurisdiction here." "That's a matter of interpretation, isn't it?" Judith replied, her tone suggesting he was a simpleton, arguing with a physicist about the nature of the universe. "You'll receive a formal letter from the management company outlining the required corrective actions and the timeline for compliance. We trust you'll handle it promptly to avoid any further administrative steps." She gave a crisp nod, turned on her heel, and marched back toward the manicured sidewalks of her domain, the young inspector scurrying in her wake like a nervous squire. Roland remained by the fence line, his hand still resting on the cedar post his father had set. The sun no longer felt hostile. It felt like a spotlight, illuminating the line that had just been drawn, not in the dirt, but in the sand of a conflict he never asked for. Later that day, Roland sat in his worn leather armchair in the ranch house office, a glass of iced tea sweating onto a coaster beside him. The room was a testament to his family's history. Photos of his father and grandfather on horseback lined the walls, their faces weathered and proud. On the wall behind his desk, framed in dark oak, was the original 1968 county plat map, its lines drawn in faded ink, and the accompanying deed for the Keaton Ranch. It was more than a document. It was a covenant. His wife, Sarah, entered, carrying a plate of cookies. She set them on the desk and wrapped her arms around his shoulders from behind, her presence a familiar comfort. She had seen the exchange at the fence line from the kitchen window. "Just a bureaucratic mistake, you think?" she asked softly, her chin resting on his head. "Has to be." Roland grunted, though the conviction in his own voice felt hollow. He gestured toward the framed map. The county lines are the county lines. An HOA survey doesn't change a legal deed. They've made an error, that's all. I'll clear it up. Sarah's hands gently kneaded his tense shoulders. Just be careful. Roll. That woman, Judith. She looks for fights. Remember the fuss she made about the Millers' basketball hoop? This isn't a basketball hoop, Sarah. This is our land. A piece of paper with a mistake on it doesn't change that. He tried to sound reassuring, for her sake as much as his own. But he couldn't shake the chill of Judith's professionally polite dismissal. It felt less like a mistake and more like a calculated opening move. I know, Sarah said, her voice laced with a worry he knew all too well. It was the same tone she used when his blood pressure readings were high. A gentle plea for him to avoid the stress that could land him back in the hospital. Just don't let her get to you. It's not worth your health. He reached up and patted her hand. I'll make a phone call tomorrow. A simple conversation with the management company. We'll sort it out. He dismissed it, pushing the unease aside. It was, as he said, a mistake. A piece of paper. But, as the sun set, casting long shadows from the old cedar posts, Roland couldn't ignore the feeling that this particular piece of paper was meant to be a weapon, and it had just been aimed directly at the heart of his legacy. The first letter, the one Judith had called a courtesy notice, arrived 2 days later. Dated May 1st. It was printed on the crisp letterhead of Pinnacle Community Management and written in a tone of cheerful menace. It politely informed Roland Keaton of a landscaping encroachment onto the Willow Creek Estate's common area, specifically citing his fence. It requested he contact their office to discuss a remediation plan. Roland read it, snorted, and filed it away. He had already left 2 voicemails for their compliance department. Neither had been returned. He would give them a few more days before trying again. The wheels of bureaucracy turned slowly. He knew that. 14 days later, the second letter arrived. This one did not come in a standard envelope. It was a certified letter, green and official, requiring his signature. The mail carrier, a young woman who always had a treat for their dog, handed it over with an apologetic shrug. Inside, the tone had shifted from cheerful to clinical. It was a formal notice of violation. Dated May 15th. It included a grainy, black-and-white photograph of his fence, looking sinister and illegal. It cited specific, fictionalized clauses from the HOA's governing documents covenants, conditions and restrictions, CC&Rs, Article 5, Section 2, view corridors and common area easements, and Architectural Control Committee ACC guidelines, Prior 8.4.2, fencing materials and placement. The letter stated that his failure to cure the violation noted in the courtesy notice had resulted in a fine of $100. He had 14 days to remove the offending fence and pay the fine through their online portal. Failure to comply would result in further enforcement action, including additional fines and a formal hearing before the board of directors. Roland carefully folded the violation letter along its original creases, his knuckles white. He placed it on the kitchen table, perfectly parallel to the edge. A small pocket of order in a world tilting into chaos. The certified mail receipt, with its long tracking number, he placed right beside it. This was no longer a mistake. This was an attack. $100, Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly as she read over his shoulder. They're fining you for our own fence on our own land. It's not about the money, Sarah. It's about the procedure. Roland tapped the paper. This is how they do it. They build a paper trail. They make it official. They try to scare you into giving up before the fight even starts. He stood up and walked into his office. He took the framed deed and plat map off the wall, the glass cool against his fingertips. This was his proof, his unassailable truth. He would not be intimidated by their forms and their fines. "There's a board meeting next Tuesday," he said, his voice hard with resolve. "It's listed as an informal work session on their website. I'm going to stand in front of them, show them this map, and end this nonsense right then and there." Sarah watched him, her expression a mixture of pride and fear. "She won't make it easy for you." "I'm not looking for easy," Roland said, laying the heavy frame on his desk. "I'm looking for right." The Willow Creek Estates Community Clubhouse was an architectural marvel of beige stucco and manufactured stone veneer. Inside, the air was chilled to an unnatural degree and smelled faintly of lemon-scented cleaner. 10 homeowners were scattered among rows of stackable chairs, facing a long table where Judith Cranford sat, flanked by 2 other board members. She presided over the meeting with the imperious calm of a queen holding court. Roland waited patiently through discussions of poolside furniture and violations for trash cans left out too long. When Judith announced the floor was open for homeowner comments, he stood, holding the framed plat map. "Judith," he began, his voice calm and respectful. "Roland Keaton, I'm here about the violation notice concerning my fence line." Judith offered a tight, professional smile. "Mr. Keaton, thank you for attending. However, this is an informal work session. Specific violation disputes must be handled through the proper channels." "The proper channel is a conversation," Roland countered, taking a step forward. "Your notice is based on an error. This is the original, county-recorded plat map from 1968. My fence is, and always has been, squarely on my property. There is no HOA easement here." He held up the map for them to see. The other homeowners leaned forward, intrigued. One of the board members, a tired-looking man named Frank, started to reach for it, but Judith held up a hand, stopping him. "While we appreciate your diligence," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "the board cannot consider evidence that has not been submitted through the official process. All documentation related to a violation appeal must be uploaded to the Pinnacle Management Portal for review by the ACC and our legal counsel. We have procedures for a reason." Roland felt a flush of anger creep up his neck. "The procedure is based on a lie. Look at the map. The truth is right here." "The truth, as you call it, is a matter for official review," Judith said, her eyes like chips of ice. She turned her attention to the rest of the room. "Now, if there are no other comments on agenda items." It was a masterful dismissal, in one clean motion. She had invalidated his evidence, stonewalled his appeal, and painted him as a disruptive outsider who didn't understand the rules. He stood there for a moment, the heavy frame in his hands feeling less like a shield of truth and more like a clumsy, useless burden. He saw the pity and discomfort in the eyes of the other homeowners. He had been procedurally and publicly humiliated. He lowered the map and walked out of the frigid clubhouse into the warm Texas air. His jaw clenched so tight it ached. He had come seeking a reasonable conversation and had been suffocated by a procedural smokescreen. This wasn't about offense. This was about power, and Judith Cranford had just shown him exactly how she intended to use it. Back home, he logged into the Pinnacle Management Resident Portal, a clunky website with an infuriating interface. With Sarah's help, he scanned his deed, the plat map, and a detailed letter explaining the discrepancy, and uploaded the files to his violation case. He hit submit and received a small, impersonal notification. Your documents have been received and will be reviewed in due course. He had followed their rules. He had played their game. Now, he would see if the truth mattered at all within their system. The first person Roland called was David Chen, a friend from church who had spent 30 years as a clerk in the Parker County Recorder's office before retiring. David arrived the next morning with a thermos of tea and a mind like a steel trap for bureaucratic details. He spread Roland's deed and the HOA's violation notice across the kitchen table. "A common area landscape easement," David murmured, peering at the notice through his bifocals. "That's clever. It sounds official, but it's often vaguely defined in the developer's initial filings. It's a tool." A tool for what, Roland asked. A land grab, piece by piece. David tapped the grainy photo of the fence. "They want you to believe their new survey supersedes your deed. It doesn't. Not without your signature on an amended plat. But they're betting you don't know that. They're betting they can fine and threaten you into submission." Roland felt a small measure of relief. "So, I'm in the right?" "Legally, absolutely," David said. "Practically, you're in a fight. You need your own survey. A fresh one. Stamped and certified, confirming the original county markers." Roland hired a local surveyor that afternoon. 2 days later, a man named Henderson, whose boots were as dusty as Roland's, spent half a day on the western pasture with transits and measuring chains. His conclusion was unequivocal. "Your fence is dead on the property line, Mr. Keaton," Henderson said, rolling up his blueprints. "Exactly where the 1968 plat says it should be." He paused, frowning. "But I did pull the HOA's new survey from the county records while I was at it. There's something odd." He unrolled the HOA's map. "See this notation here? It claims a scrivener's error in the original 1968 description of this boundary. That's their justification for shifting the line 10 feet onto your parcel. But a scrivener's error of that magnitude, perfectly aligned with your entire fence line, it's highly improbable. It looks less like correcting a typo and more like manufacturing a pretext." The surveyor's report was a bombshell. But it was followed by another. A new certified letter from Pinnacle Management arrived. Dated June 1st. It informed him that his submitted documents had been reviewed and found insufficient to overturn the violation. His fine had now escalated to $500 for non-compliance. Furthermore, he was being summoned to a formal hearing before the Board of Directors on June 15th, where they would vote on levying further fines and, crucially, authorizing legal counsel to file a notice of lien against the property for failure to pay outstanding assessments. A lien. The word landed in the quiet room like a physical blow. They could cloud his title, damage his credit, and, if the fines mounted high enough, theoretically, force a sale to satisfy the debt. They were threatening to take his land not with bulldozers, but with binders and bylaws. The stakes had escalated from a simple fine to the security of his entire legacy. He had the truth on his side, a certified surveyor's report confirming it. But he was up against an institution that had the power to simply declare his truth insufficient. David Chen, ever the pragmatist, filed a formal records request with the HOA on Roland's behalf, demanding copies of all board meeting minutes from the past year. The response came back a week later, a thick stack of papers. As they sifted through them, David stopped at a page from a meeting held 3 months prior. "Here it is," he said, his finger tracing a line of text. "Agenda Item 4B, Discussion of Western Boundary Survey and the Keaton Parcel." The paragraph that followed was a solid block of black ink. It had been entirely redacted, with a single, chilling footnote, redacted pursuant to attorney-client privilege. "They're hiding something," Roland said, his voice low. They had their lawyer in on this from the beginning. Of course they did. David said grimly. This was never about landscaping. Roland. This was planned. The mystery of Judith's obsession hung in the air, a question without an answer. The answer came not from a document, but from a quiet voice in the produce aisle of the local grocery store 3 days later. Eleanor Vance, a widow in her late 70s, who lived in the subdivision and served on the HOA board, placed a hand on Roland's arm as he was inspecting a cantaloupe. She had been friends with his mother for years, a connection that transcended the new fence lines. Roland, a word, she whispered, her eyes darting around nervously. I cannot speak openly at the meetings. Judith. She controls the agenda completely. But you need to know this isn't what it seems. She led him to a quiet corner near the dairy case. 30 years ago, just after Judith's father, a developer named Arthur Cranford, bought the land for Willow Creek. He came to see your father. He wanted to buy a 10-foot wide strip along that entire western edge, said he needed it for a utility right-of-way. Your father refused. He said not 1 inch of Keaton land was for sale. Ever. Arthur was furious. He was a man who didn't take no for an answer. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't just a property dispute. It was a multi-generational grudge. Judith was trying to take by force what her father had failed to take by negotiation. Eleanor wasn't finished. There's more, she said, her voice barely audible. A new developer, a big commercial outfit from Dallas, has been making offers on some of the larger lots bordering the highway. They want to build a high-end retail center, but they need more frontage. That 10-foot strip of yours. It's the key. It gives them the access and the setback they need to make the deal work. Judith has been in private meetings with them for months. Greed and a 30-year-old grudge. The two most powerful motivators on earth. The redacted minutes, the flawed survey, the procedural stonewalling, it all made sense. Judith wasn't trying to beautify a common area. She was trying to settle a family score and clear the way for a lucrative development deal, using the full, crushing weight of the HOA as her personal sledgehammer. The hearing was in 10 days. Roland now knew what he was fighting, and why. But knowing the truth and proving it to a hostile board were two very different things. With the hearing looming, Roland and David worked methodically to assemble an ironclad defense packet. It contained everything: a copy of his original deed, the 1968 county plat map, the new certified survey from Henderson explicitly refuting the HOA's claim, a timeline of events, and a cover letter summarizing his position. We send this via certified mail, return receipt requested, David advised, and we also upload it to their portal again. We create a record they can't deny receiving. Roland did exactly that. He drove to the post office and sent the thick envelope to the address listed for Pinnacle Community Management. The next day, he carefully uploaded each scanned document to the online portal, taking screenshots as proof of the successful submission. The green receipt from the post office arrived in his mailbox 2 days later, signed by a receptionist at Pinnacle. He felt a sliver of confidence. He had followed their process to the letter. They had his evidence. The hearing was scheduled for Thursday evening. On Tuesday morning, just 48 hours before he was set to plead his case, Roland received an automated email notification, "Reminder your hearing, regarding violation. V2-23-417 is scheduled for June 15th at 7:00 p.m. Please be advised that no evidence packet has been received from you for the board to review in advance." Roland stared at the screen, his blood running cold. No evidence packet received. It was impossible. He immediately called the management company. After 20 minutes on hold, a blandly cheerful representative named Chloe answered. "Yes. Mr. Keaton, I see your case file. she said after he explained the situation. "And I'm sorry. But there are no documents attached to your violation record other than the ones from the association." "That's impossible," Roland said, his voice rising despite his efforts to remain calm. "I uploaded them myself. I have screenshots. I also sent a hard copy via certified mail. I have the signed receipt right here." There was a pause, and the sound of typing. "I'm very sorry, sir, but our system shows no uploads, and we have no record of receiving a mail packet for this case. Sometimes mail gets misplaced between the mailroom and the correct department. Without the documents being officially logged into your file, the board cannot consider them." The excuse was so flimsy, so transparently false, that Roland felt a wave of dizzying anger. They had lost it. Or, more likely, they had made it disappear. Judith had rigged the system from the inside, ensuring the board would only see her side of the story. His carefully prepared defense had been vanished into a bureaucratic black hole. "So what am I supposed to do?" Roland asked, his voice tight. "The hearing is in 2 days." "You are still welcome to attend and speak." "Of course," Chloe said, her voice radiating practiced, insincere sympathy. "But the board's decision will be based on the documentation provided by our accredited surveyor. The matter is closed for discussion at this time." The line clicked dead. He hung up the phone, his hand trembling. For a moment, he felt a crushing sense of defeat. He had been outmaneuvered. He pictured himself standing before the board, empty-handed, while Judith calmly read from her surveyor's report, and the board voted unanimously to place a lien on his home. Sarah came into the office and saw the look on his face. "What is it?" "They lost it all," he said, the words tasting like ash. "They claim they never got it." Sarah was silent for a moment. Then, she placed her hands on his shoulders. "No, they didn't," she said with a fierce certainty that startled him. "They have it. They're just pretending they don't. So you can't fight them in their private little hearing. You have to fight them in public." Her words cut through his despair. She was right. A private hearing could be controlled, its outcome predetermined. But there was another venue, one that couldn't be so easily manipulated. "The annual homeowners meeting," Roland said, the idea taking root. "It's the same night as the hearing, right before it." "Exactly," Sarah said. "There's an open forum. Any homeowner can speak." A new plan began to form, born of desperation and righteous anger. He couldn't trust their system, so he would have to bypass it. He would not go into that hearing as a defendant in a kangaroo court. He would go into the public meeting as a citizen, armed with the truth, and he would present his case not to a biased board, but to the entire community. He had less than 48 hours. He needed to regather his proof, not just copies, but originals. He needed to go back to the source. "David," he said, already dialing his friend's number. "We're going to the county recorder's office, first thing in the morning, and I need to get Henderson's report recertified." He looked at Sarah, a grim smile touching his lips for the first time that day. "And Sarah, we're going to need to make a trip to the copy shop. I want to make the biggest foam board poster they've ever seen." The annual homeowners meeting was held in the clubhouse ballroom, a cavernous space with bad acoustics and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look pale and tired. The room was packed, nearly 100 homeowners sitting in uncomfortable chairs, fanning themselves with copies of the night's agenda. The air was thick with a mixture of cheap coffee and simmering resentment, the default atmosphere for any gathering of people forced to govern themselves. Roland sat in the back row with Sarah, a large, cloth-draped foam board leaning against his chair. He had his slim file on his lap, the certified mail receipt, Henderson's recertified report, and, afresh, Official copy of the 1968 plat map he and David had picked up from the county office the day before. He felt a cold, focused calm. The agenda was, as always, tedious. The treasurer read a mind-numbing financial report. The landscaping committee chair droned on about perennial selection. Finally, Judith, seated at the center of the board table, announced the final item before the executive session hearing the homeowner open forum. Each speaker will be limited to 3 minutes, she announced, gesturing to a large digital countdown clock projected onto the screen behind her. Please state your name and address for the record. Before Roland could stand, Judith recognized another board member. The board first brings a motion regarding the property at 214 Willow Creek Lane, she said, her voice sharp and official. The homeowners, the Miller family, have received 3 notices for a non-compliant basketball hoop, which remains in public view. The ACC recommends a fine of $200 and a daily penalty until the structure is removed. A young couple, the Millers, sitting near the front, visibly shrank in their seats. Mr. Miller stood, looking flustered. "It's for our kids," he stammered. "We move it into the garage at night. It's only out when they're playing." "The CC&Rs are quite clear," Judith said, her voice devoid of sympathy. Article 7. Section 4. No temporary play structures shall be visible from the street. The board is simply enforcing the rules you agreed to when you purchased your home. A murmur of discontent rippled through the room. It was a petty, mean-spirited enforcement, and everyone knew it. This was Roland's moral twist, the unexpected fork in the road. His fight was next. His precious 3 minutes were all he had. But he could not sit by and watch this family be publicly steamrolled. He stood. "Mr. Keaton, you will have your turn," Judith said dismissively. "My comment is on this motion," Roland said, his voice ringing with authority. The room quieted. "I've read the governing documents. May I ask the board to refer to the bylaws?" Article 3. Section 1. It states that the board must exercise its authority in a reasonable and uniform manner. Fining a family for a basketball hoop that is in use by children, while ignoring other, more significant violations, is neither reasonable nor uniform. The motion is punitive and should be voted down. He sat. The silence was profound. He had used their own rules against them, eloquently and precisely. Judith's face tightened, a flicker of fury in her eyes. The Millers looked at him with stunned gratitude. Before Judith could recover, Eleanor Vance, the moral compass on the board, spoke up. "I move to table this motion indefinitely." Another board member seconded. The motion to table passed. 3-2. Judith had lost control. "Next speaker," she snapped, her eyes fixed on Roland. Roland walked to the front of the room, placed his file on the lectern, and turned to face the community. The 3-minute clock started its countdown, 3:00, 2:59. "My name is Roland Keaton. My family has owned the ranch bordering this community since before any of these houses were built." His voice was steady, conversational, for the past 6 weeks. "I have been in a dispute with the board over my property line. I have been fined, ignored, and summoned to a hearing where I am being denied the right to present evidence. They claim they lost it." He held up the green certified mail receipt. "This is the post office receipt, signed by Pinnacle Management on June 5th, for the evidence packet they claim to have never received." 2:30, 2:29. He turned and unveiled his first foam board, placing it on an easel. It was a huge, clear copy of the official 1968 Parker County plat map. "This is the legal map of my property. The red line shows my boundary, unchanged for 54 years. 205, 204. He then unveiled the second board. It was the HOA's 2023 survey. This is the survey the board is using. Notice the scrivener's error they claim to have found, which conveniently moves the property line 10 feet onto my land. My own certified surveyor calls this pretext. 130, 129. Why would the board go to such lengths? For a landscape easement. He paused, letting the question hang in the air. Or is it because Judith Cranford's father tried to buy this exact same strip of land from my father 30 years ago and was refused? Is it because a commercial developer needs that land for a new retail center, and Judith has been meeting with them? A fact conveniently redacted from the board minutes. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The calm, methodical presentation of facts was more devastating than any shouted accusation. The room was utterly silent, every eye fixed on him. Then, shifting to Judith, whose professional mask was crumbling, revealing a face pale with rage. 045, 044. This has never been about offense. It's been about a personal grudge and a secret real estate deal, executed using your HOA dues and the power you entrusted to this board. I have followed every rule. I have submitted every form, and I was silenced. So I came here, to the open forum, to speak to you, my neighbors. The hearing they have scheduled for me is a sham. The real hearing is right here, right now, and you are the judges. The clock hit 003, 002, 001, 000. He had finished. He gathered his papers and walked back to his seat as a stunned silence enveloped the room. The silence was finally broken, not by Judith, but by Eleanor Vance. She stood, her voice frail but steady. I believe Mr. Keaton has raised issues of profound importance regarding the board's transparency and fiduciary duty. Therefore, I move that the board immediately commission a fully independent boundary survey, to be conducted by a firm with no prior connection to this association. Furthermore, I move for a complete, independent financial audit of all board expenditures and contracts for the past 24 months. A man in the front row jumped to his feet. Seconded. Judith slammed her gavel. This is out of order. There is no such motion on the agenda. But the tide had turned. The room erupted. Let's vote, someone shouted. Vote, vote, others chanted. The management company representative, a man in a rumpled suit, looked positively ill over Judith's protests. Frank, the tired-looking board member, called for a show of hands. It was a sea of them. The motion passed by an overwhelming majority. Judith and her two allies on the board sat in stunned, impotent fury. The homeowners were in open revolt, galvanized by Roland's quiet, courageous stand, pending the results of the survey and the audit. The board was effectively censured, its power broken in a single, 3-minute speech. As the meeting dissolved into a chaotic buzz of conversations, the Millers came over to Roland, their faces shining with relief and gratitude. Thank you, Mr. Miller said, shaking Roland's hand with both of his own. You didn't have to do that. You used your own time to help us. A fence is just a line, Roland said quietly, looking at his neighbors. A community is what matters. He and Sarah walked out into the cool night air. As they reached their truck, Roland glanced back at the clubhouse. He saw Judith through the large glass window, sitting alone at the board table after everyone else had left. The harsh fluorescent lights exposed every crack in her composure. She wasn't angry anymore. She just looked small, defeated. A woman whose intricate web of lies had been patiently and publicly unraveled. The war was over. The truth had won. Weeks later, the fallout settled like dust after a storm. The independent survey confirmed what Roland had known all along. His fence stood exactly on his property line. The financial audit was even more damning. It uncovered a trail of emails and preliminary agreements between Judith and the Dallas developer, revealing she stood to receive a substantial consulting fee if the deal for the retail center went through. Faced with irrefutable proof of self-dealing and breach of fiduciary duty, Judith Cranford and her 2 loyal board members resigned in disgrace. The management company, Pinnacle, was placed on probation, their contract under review. A special election was held, and a new board was voted in, with Eleanor Vance unanimously elected as its new president. At the first meeting of the new board, their first official act was to formally rescind all violations and fines against Roland Keaton, issuing him a formal, public apology on behalf of the association. Roland and Sarah were in attendance that night when Eleanor announced the decision. A wave of applause filled the clubhouse, the same room where he had been humiliated just a month before. But Roland felt no sense of triumph, only a quiet relief. He had won back his peace, defended his legacy. That was enough. But he had one final surprise. When the applause died down, Eleanor recognized him for a final comment. Roland stood, not at the lectern, but from his place among his neighbors. "Thank you," he began. "This was a difficult time for our community. A lot of trust was broken. Fines were levied, not to maintain standards, but to intimidate people. And while my fines were reversed, others were not. My wife and I would like to propose something." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the Millers and others who had been unfairly targeted. "I propose we establish a community reconciliation fund. It would be seeded with any mislevied fines the audit uncovers and returned from the old board's misconduct. That money wouldn't go back to the HOA's general fund. It would be used to help neighbors resolve disputes collaboratively, through mediation, before they ever get to the violation stage. It could help pay for a shared survey in a boundary dispute, or help a family modify something to bring it into compliance without punitive fines. It's a way to turn a conflict that divided us into a resource that brings us together." The idea was met with a moment of thoughtful silence, and then a slow, building wave of applause, warmer and more genuine than before. It was a constructive, healing gesture. He hadn't just torn down a corrupt system. He was helping to build a better one in its place. Later, walking back to their truck under a canopy of stars, Sarah slipped her hand into his. "My father would have been proud of you," she said softly. Roland looked across the pasture toward the dark, solid line of his fence. He had stood his ground, not with aggression, but with integrity. He had protected the land not just for himself, but for the principle that truth, spoken calmly and backed by facts, was more powerful than any lie shouted from a position of authority. The long fight was over, and the quiet of the ranch felt earned, deeper and more peaceful than it had in a very long time.